everyone. Welcome back to another episode of I Don't Know Who Needs to Hear This podcast. I'm Gabrielle, and I'm here with my amazing co-host Lauren, and we are excited for another conversation with all of you today. If you are just tuning in for the first time, and you're curious who we are, or where we come from, or anything like that, we do have an intro episode that you might want to listen to first. But if you just want to dive right into this one, we're happy to have you here too, and we're excited for another great conversation today.
So today we were going to dive into a little bit of this discourse that we've seen online related to the BBC investigation and sort of these sweeping calls for regulation in the sleep industry.
Yeah.
And I think both of us have maybe not a hot take, but a different kind of opinion about it or some concerns about it. And so just wanting to sort of dive into that today and let that lead us into some other conversations that probably need to be had about the industry and really just experts online, parenting experts online in general.
Right. Yeah, and I think it becomes a very important topic to talk about because at the end of the day, parents are out there kind of in their most vulnerable state of life, trusting what they see online and trusting experts, quote unquote experts, and trusting that the information they're getting is coming from a reputable source. And I think that what we need to make sure we do in this conversation is not, I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. Like, I don't want to sit here and say that like the BBC investigation, the calls for regulation are unnecessary or that they're wrong or that's like something we shouldn't be doing, because that's not what we're saying at all. But I think it's getting a little bit overgeneralized. I think that's the word I'm looking for, where we think regulation is the answer, the end all be all to the sore spots or sort of the negative aspects of the sleep industry. And that's just not necessarily the answer. So I think that's what the conversation we want to have here is not to be in contrast or, on the opposite end of the whole BBC investigation, but kind of expand upon it and go a little bit above and beyond what the surface level of that conversation is.
Yeah. So for people that don't know, the BBC recently did an investigation. I think it was 2 sleep trainers that they scheduled a session with, and those sleep trainers offered some dangerous, harmful advice to the parents in the investigation that were consulting with them. One of them was that I think she said something like the Back to Sleep campaign was like the biggest travesty. And so she was recommending to parents that to get their baby to sleep through the night, that they put them down on their stomachs to sleep, which we know is incredibly dangerous. And we have all seen the data on the Back to Sleep initiative and how that reduced, I think it was 80%, a really big decrease in those deaths and outcomes. And then the other sleep trainer, I think, was recommending like blankets, a lot of blankets, like around the baby's face, and was actually sending images to parents. And those images had fabrics and stuff right up by baby's face. And I think that, yes, like there should be like some sort of like agency that you can report those things to and people can be held accountable to those kinds of things. I just have a lot of concerns as it relates to like sweeping regulation.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree. And we both come from regulated industries and underregulated industries. So I know what it's like to be in the regulated industry as like a social worker and having those sort of governing bodies to report to. And, you the same with nursing. So I think having the perspectives that we do will be a valuable part of this conversation. So I just wanted to kind of, because I think that's something we mentioned in the intro episode, that, we both do have licenses in different industries in addition to sleep, or in addition to certifications in sleep. So, just kind of having the perspective of both those types of industries makes it, I think, a valuable conversation to have for sure.
Yeah. And I think that when it comes to sleep in particular, it can get really dicey because your regulating body, whoever that
Yeah.
becomes or whatever that looks like, is then going to set standards.
Right.
And when we have seen this happen in nursing, that regulating body is going to pick a thought, a
Yeah.
line of thought, right?
Yeah.
And we already know in the United States what that line of thought is or
Hmm.
what that thought process is. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, it is really behaviorist and promoting, essentially conditioning strategies to infants. And
Right.
when you have a baby at the hospital, right, like those are facilities who are really impacted by
Yeah.
agencies, and
Right.
there is a really strong resistance to offering safe bed sharing
Yeah.
information when you're discharged from the hospital. A lot of um, parents have to watch a video saying like they'll never bring their baby to bed, and there's very scary language in some of the
I had to sign
pamphlets.
a
And
form. I don't know if you did. I had to
yeah,
sign like a form.
yes,
I actually found it the other day in my son's like hospital discharge paperwork. I had to sign a paper before I left saying I will never bring my baby into bed with me, which is just so crazy to think about now. But yes.
yes, yeah, but like that is the mindset of the AAP. And not that
Hmm.
the AAP is like super governing or whatever, but they're the ones
No,
putting
yeah.
out the recommendations. And
Right.
I think that then you have providers who are afraid to even speak about, even if they totally believe in bed sharing, they are
Right.
fearful of sharing the really valuable knowledge that they know
Yeah.
because it becomes a liability because you have
Right.
this big body that is making recommendations that
Yeah.
are rooted in really backwards society,
Yeah.
like those norms that are kind of backwards in society. So I think that it can get really problematic. And I think I saw it a lot in nursing. And I think some of the good examples of that, like, so there's a lot of good examples in public health in general, right? Like,
Yeah.
humans are not textbooks. We have sort of these agencies and these studies and stuff that have told us like this is this best standard of care. That doesn't mean that that patient has the accessibility or support to do those things. Perhaps they don't have
Yeah.
insurance, or they don't have a ride, or they don't have a job.
Right.
Like
Right.
they're just, it can be problematic from like a public health standpoint like that. But also when we get really like if a hospital initiates a policy, so like a heparin policy, there have been many studies on heparin, and we've sort of discovered in these studies like the therapeutic range, but sometimes people fall out of that, right? And so now
Yeah.
you have someone who requires more or much less, which is
Right.
where you kind of get yourself in trouble and you start having, bleeding and things like that. Like it's not always great. Now,
Yeah.
I'm not saying that like some babies should sleep on their bellies, right? Like that's not what I'm
Right.
saying,
Right.
but I'm saying be careful what you call for,
Right.
because
Hmm.
we have the tendency to say in the United States, go back to work, get back to
Yeah.
productivity, put the
Yes.
burden on your baby, right? And so, would that be what the agency recommends? And then, would someone like you and I,
Yeah.
would it be reportable for me to say
Right.
sleep training is potentially harmful?
For sharing safe bed sharing
Yes.
information. That's one
Yeah.
of my biggest fears is when if we are talking about regulation here, who's doing the regulating, and if it's someone, a body like the AAP or people from the AAP or part of the regulatory board, and their stance is, absolutely no bed sharing, and that becomes part of this regulation conversation and the standards that we're held to and the requirements and all of that, are we going to be then held liable or get in trouble for providing just safe bed share information from Safe Sleep 7 and from, James McKenna, Dr. James McKenna, and those types of things? Is suddenly that going to be a situation where we are held liable or at risk of losing like our sleep certifications or something like that? Because that's what is that's the snowball effect of being in these regulated industries. If you do something that's outside the regulations and it's reportable, then you are at risk of like losing your ability to help families anymore, help patients, help clients. So that's like kind of my biggest fear is not necessarily regulation itself, but who is doing it, who's making the rules and regulations, and what are their biases, what are their um, what word am I looking for? Like, where are they coming from morally, ethically, kind of
Yeah.
who's making these decisions and who's going to be at the table essentially when the regulation conversation is happening. Are you just going to have doctors, or are you going to have doctors, lactation consultants, doulas, midwives, co-sleeping experts? Are you going to have people from different cultures, different parts of the world, different family structures? Are you different financial, economic brackets? Like, are you going to have all these people at the table having this regulation conversation, or are you only going to have the more westernized, behaviorist, medically minded professionals at the table? Because I think those people should be there, and I think you also need to have all these other people at the table too, having this regulation conversation.
Exactly. And I think it's really polarizing, right? Like people have like really, I mean, to me, it feels, I'm a very rigid black and white thinker, and I have a
Mm-hmm.
really hard time with a physician recommending cry it out for a 2 month old. Like I
Yeah,
can't just like there's nothing you could say to me that would ever make
yeah,
me think that that is okay.
yep,
And I know like the opposite side of that is like parent mental health, which we're gonna obviously deep dive in another area. But like
mm-hmm.
there are like legitimate opposing factors there, right? Like
Yeah,
perhaps a parent is a single parent or
yep,
whatever, and they have a very demanding job or whatever is going on.
yep,
But I think like at a certain point, we have to, like, if we just keep doing what we're doing, like we will never change the
yeah,
system, right? And the
yep,
system
yep,
belief is, right, like we prioritize getting back to work, we prioritize productivity, and we sort of put that burden on the baby at this point, is what we're doing.
yep,
And like
yep,
people don't like hearing that, but like that is like sleep training, that industry is a behavioral modification intervention. That's what like it is, conditioning, right? It
yeah,
is
yep,
conditioning your baby. So
yep,
I think that when we have a lot of people at the table, like you said, that agree with that mindset, there is the potential for that to go
yeah,
way in the wrong
right.
direction and be really harmful to a lot of babies and
Yeah.
families.
Right. Like, and I truly have this fear based on, the way our, especially in the US and more westernized countries, like the way it all works, that if quote unquote like regulation were to happen, one side of the spectrum is going to be pushed out of the industry. It's either like the sleep trainers are going to be pushed out, or the non-sleep trainers are going to be pushed out. And just the way everything else has gone up to this point, the non-sleep trainers are going to be the ones that, get lifted out or get pushed out. And that really concerns me because, we can do a whole another episode on this too, maybe, but the sleep training research does not conclusively say that it is safe, or that it's helpful, or that it works for every baby, or that it never causes any harm. And I know you talk about this a lot and I talk about this a lot, but we cannot just like put that as a blanket statement and make that the standard of care, because it's not evidence based to say that. But I fear that, with just all the voices that do have a seat at the table right now, that might be the way the conversation goes. So it really does concern me from that aspect. The other thing that like comes up in this conversation is, I think in this call for regulation, a lot of the people behind this movement for regulation are of the mindset that sleep coaches like me and you should not be giving advice or education about like medical red flags that impact sleep, like saying that's out of our scope, like we should never be talking about that. And that part concerns me too, because what we're doing in our roles as sleep coaches is never providing medical advice. And that would be a situation where that would be a reportable offense, right? If a sleep coach is giving explicit medical advice that's out of their scope, absolutely, that could be reportable or out of the bounds of, the code of conduct or standard of care. But for us to sit here and listen to a mom talk about how her baby is snoring and mouth breathing and has reflux and can't breathe through their nose or whatever comes up in those conversations, for us to just sit here with our hands tied as sleep coaches and be like, oh yeah, like sorry, like that stinks, like I don't know, like good luck with that, that feels, completely highly unethical in many ways. And so for us to not be able to then help them find the right providers and provide education about how those things might be impacting sleep, that would be a big disservice to these families that are struggling. So I also worry about that aspect of regulation is, are we actually going to look at the full picture of sleep and what
Mm-hmm.
impacts sleep, what doesn't impact sleep? Because again, the sort of default is to look at sleep from this behaviorist standpoint. And if a baby isn't sleeping, we need to train them to sleep. And there's no conversation about quality of sleep, how they're sleeping, is there anything getting in the way of them being able to sleep? And if that's the default, or if that's all we're quote unquote allowed to do, we are doing these babies and these families a great disservice. So I think that's where there needs to be a lot of nuance and, again, more voices at the table of this conversation, saying that coaches, like me and you, who are educated in sort of these potential sleep disruptors, at least to, a certain degree, are able to provide these resources to families to help them navigate these things that will ultimately support their baby's lifelong health. Because that's what we're doing here too, is we're not just saying like we're going to fix sleep tonight. We're setting the scene for sleep and wellness and regulation throughout this baby's entire life, and therefore also impacting the overall regulation and stress levels of the family unit and the household. And it just is so much bigger than, I'm here to fix your baby's sleep. Like,
Yeah.
it's a much bigger picture, and sleep coaches really have the potential to be a, a big saving grace and a big support for these families if we're able to do so and to talk about all those things.
Yes, what a great place to go with that. So when I first started my account, I didn't know what I didn't know. And I think that is like a really scary thing
Mm-hmm.
for parents.
Yeah,
Like you just don't know what you don't know. And they say like
yeah,
motherhood is so intuitive and
yeah,
like what like currently and I just like want to say like I am seeing sort of the worst of the worst cases. Like
yeah,
I market myself that way. Like I'm seeing medically complex, visually impaired, and that can greatly impact circadian rhythm and
mm-hmm.
neurodivergent and true circadian rhythm sleep wake disorder. Like I'm seeing, so
Yeah,
I just want to like put that out there that like
yeah,
when I am talking, like I have a biased sample, right? Like the families that I'm seeing are really navigating a lot more, like they're kind of living in the extreme.
yeah,
But when I started my account, I was very much like I didn't know
yeah,
much of what I know now. So I was
yeah,
like highly sensitive, temperament, and my main goal was like let's talk about biologically normal sleep.
right,
And I don't want to pathologize sleep. And sort of what this has grown into is like, I can't even work with a family on sleep because they are getting the runaround so badly. Like, they have
yeah,
all of these things going on. They are being gaslit by their medical providers. No
yep,
one's taking them seriously. And you and I think it was you and I that had a conversation a while back where you're like, oh, you're kind of like this medical advocate. Like,
yeah,
like really that is like what I spend most of my time doing, right? Like I
yeah,
can talk with a family about this slew of red flags, which isn't limited just to like medical things necessarily. Like we've got sensory processing differences and
right,
neurodivergence and those kinds of things. And nobody wants to take those things seriously in an
no,
infant. And when I say infant, I mean birth to 3, right? Like we're just gaslighting families for years. So we are not listening to their medical concerns. We're not getting them into early intervention. We're not supporting their sensory system. We're just suppressing their signaling that all these things are going on.
right,
And so I think to me, it is terrifying to remove that. And like, I make it very clear when I am working with clients, like, I cannot diagnose this, but like, here are the people you need to see. And then unfortunately, I have to be like, here's how they're going to gaslight you,
yeah,
likely.
yep,
And
yep,
here are your talking points. And I work with a lot of parents who freeze in that situation, right?
yeah,
So I'm giving them talking points they can say in the office, but oftentimes what our plan is, go to the office, tell me what they say, and we will draft something that you can send through the patient
yeah.
portal. because it is
Yeah.
easier for parents to stand up for
Yeah.
themselves in the patient portal than it is in that
Totally.
office setting, because there's like a dynamic
Hmm.
and like it just, to take that away, like I know I see it every time I do a consult, what like parents are really going through it, trying to
Yep.
even get ferritin, like just to get
Yeah.
ferritin checked, like we have
Yeah.
to sometimes get a second and third opinion. And I have yet to ever find an example where we have pushed for a second or third opinion and something wasn't going on. And I've been
Yeah.
doing this almost 3 years, and it's like, this is so much bigger than sleep. Like this
Yes.
is,
Totally.
it's like it's advocacy work. It's not,
Yeah.
so it's really scary to potentially be pushed out of
Yeah.
sort of an
Yeah.
area where that is so needed.
Yeah, no, it is terrifying. And can I just say too, like, what a blessing you are to these families. And I can say that also as a
Thank you.
family, as a mom that you, of course, a mom that like you helped me in that role, in many ways, over the past year or 2 years. So I just want to like, if you are a blessing to these families to be that advocate for them. And I can say that, professionally and also personally, because you served that role for me and it was beyond helpful because you're right. There is a power dynamic. There is this sort of like opportunity to feel gaslit, to feel like you're gonna freeze and just like not know what to do. And yeah, you have to push. And a mom who is like totally already sleep deprived, depleted, confused, vulnerable should then not have to like fight with medical professionals to get these things looked at. And like even my own personal experience, I don't know if you remember, but on one of your posts, like this is probably going back like 2 years ago when we first were connected on social media, you posted about ferritin, and I had to like push to get my son's ferritin tested, and his ferritin ended up being a 7, which is like beyond low. Like it's
Very low.
seven. A 7 is so low, and that was after 2 months of like begging his pediatrician to order a labs for his iron levels. And I had to push for it, and I had some of the language to push for it from like you and some other people that were on Instagram or social media at the time. But parents should not have to fight for that, and they should not have to feel like they are swimming upstream constantly when they're already dealing with so much and already kind of depleted and feeling beaten down just by like the sleep itself. Because we're not here to say that sleep deprivation is like not a thing or like not something that affects parents. Of course it does. And then it adds this whole extra layer of just absolute, I don't know, mayhem and chaos and
Yeah.
just feeling completely discouraged when you have to swim upstream, with the people who are supposed to be helping you or supposed to be supporting you.
The
So
people who
yes,
are
I
supposed
agree.
to be helping you, who are in a regulated field, right? So like
Exactly.
that, they are
Yes.
in a regulated field, and
Yes.
in my opinion, and not all of them, right? Like I
Yeah.
have a friend who has texted me about ferritin, and I gave her the whole spiel. Like, this is what they're going to
Yeah.
say. This is what they're going to do.
Yeah.
After you start supplementing, like they're not going to want to do a recheck. Like I made a course on
Yeah.
ferritin, and it's an hour long
Yeah.
because like getting the lab checked and starting a supplement is like the beginning. Like you
Yeah.
got,
Yep.
like there are non-responders, and your ferritin can be tightly regulated based on iron. Like we could do a whole episode on that. I did a course. But like I prepared her for this, and she walked out of the appointment and called me and was like, she did everything you said. And so like they're out there. The good
It
ones are out
happens.
there.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Um, but it's not like and
No.
again, my sample size is biased and they're really going through it, but like this is a regulated field. A lot of these physicians are board certified. A lot of
Yep.
them are IBCLCs, and
Yeah.
the advice coming out of their practices is crazy to me. Like
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
know how you can be a board certified pediatrician who's also an IBCLC and make the claim that a 2-month old should not feed during the night
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
should be left to cry it out. Like that to me feels reportable.
Yes. Totally. Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah. And just to kind of validate what you're saying too, I know you said your sample size is biased to some degree, but or like you're seeing the worst of the worst,
Yeah.
but your your sample size could also be any like your samples could be anyone's kid, and like you
Yeah.
don't know if that's going to be your kid until they're here. And so I think that's where yes, you are seeing the worst of the worst, but you're the kids you're working with and the families you're working with could be anyone's kid in anyone's family. And you don't know that going into parenthood. You don't know what kind of things your kid is going to be dealing with. And we need to have a system that supports all possibilities and like all the whole spectrum of kids and their needs and what they could be dealing with versus a system that only supports the kids that are like quote unquote, normal, or they don't have these
Yeah.
extenuating circumstances or these sort of like other things that are disrupting sleep, or just overall well-being. Because the kids you see, and some of the families I work with too, I don't see sort of like the worst of the worst, quote unquote, that you do, but these could be anyone's kids and they could be
Yeah.
anyone's families, and we need to have a system that supports all of them versus a system that kind of ostracizes them.
Yeah. And I think part of the problem too is that when we're talking about like regulated bodies and things like that, we're getting a lot of the information and the data from physicians, right? So
Yeah,
when we're talking about, oh, there's, 20% of the population is highly sensitive, or 3% of individuals get an autism diagnosis, like, I think likely those percentages are much higher. I
yeah,
think it's just like not something that is being appropriately worked through.
yeah,
Like we're doing, there's a lot of gaslighting and a lot of sort
yeah,
of dismissiveness. And so I think that if we are forced into a situation where the overwhelming discussion online becomes sleep training to get out of these
yeah,
things, like what are we doing? Because it's not just, I focus on, highly sensitive and neurodivergent, but it's not just those kids or those
yeah,
babies or those parents who are
yeah.
impacted by those things. You don't have to be
Right,
highly sensitive or neurodivergent to have an airway issue, right?
right,
So
correct.
like when we're talking about like 20% or 3%, like many children have
Yeah,
low ferritin. So that actual percentage of an underlying thing going on there is much higher. And so I sort of struggled with that because I don't want to pathologize normal sleep. I
yeah,
want to talk about that, but it's just I can't even get there because first we've
right.
got to, because you could do all the right things, right? You can
Yes,
be high nurture, your timing can be perfect. You can really have an understanding of their
right,
24-hour sleep needs. And if they have like periodic limb movement disorder, manifest, like if they're
right,
manifesting that way because their iron is or their ferritin is so low, like it
right,
doesn't matter what you do, they're going to
right.
struggle.
Right. I do want to add a caveat to that though, where to just the parents listening, where if you are doing kind of the high nurture things and you're supporting them and being there, it is making a difference. It is helping. So I don't want parents to feel like, oh my gosh, like my kid's dealing with all this stuff and like I'm trying to provide them with high nurture and it's like it doesn't matter. It's not making a difference. It's making a difference. It matters. Because high nurture, high responsiveness, closeness, proximity, all those amazing things, but they buffer the effects of some of these maybe medical concerns or other things we're talking about, sensory differences. There's a buffering effect because from
Yeah.
that high nurture and from that closeness and responsiveness. So I always try to tell that to families, that are dealing with maybe some of these issues where other providers need to be involved, appointments need to be made, and they're feeling kind of like overwhelmed by all those steps that need to be taken, reminding them your nurture and your responsiveness and your closeness is making a difference. Like it is
Yeah.
mattering to them because even if, for example, a kid like my son, for example, like, he dealt with horrible reflux, among other things, horrible reflux for like the first year of his life. And it was horrible for him physically, but I know that like contact napping, holding him close, like being there for him made how he felt physically a little bit better or a little bit easier to deal with because he knew that he wasn't alone in it and he had the proximity. So all that to say, it makes a difference providing the nurture day and night, even if you're still kind of in this long game of figuring out the other stuff and treating it and supporting those other needs.
Yes, 1,000%, which is why it would be terrible to have sort
Yes,
of us removed and then it
right,
be, don't, like you're spoiling your baby, they're
right,
manipulating you, they can,
right,
you know, take their pacifier away when you have
right,
perhaps a baby with sensory processing disorder. Like it would just be,
right,
to me, it feels like it would be really catastrophic to say, like, we're going to remove like sort of this high nurture industry that because personally I was not a high nurture person and I had no
mm-hmm.
like education on high nurture and that kind of
Yeah,
stuff, and so like I needed like that social media and presence
Yeah,
to like
right,
have the language. And like I think that's really tough is if a parent doesn't have the language, they don't even know what to look up. You don't, it's
right.
really sometimes hard to stumble into that information
Yeah,
if you don't have, you got to have something to look
yeah,
up or be able to label what you're experiencing. And I think that if, like you said, one one group is sort of pushed out, it could be really sort of
yeah,
catastrophic for babies and their
right.
families. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, and it's going to hurt the babies who need the support the most. And and that's always been the case with the whole sleep training conversation is the babies who are most likely to be sleep trained or attempted sleep training are the ones who are most inappropriate for. And I think that
Yeah.
is the crux of this conversation is, the ones who are going to suffer the most are the ones who are like need the most support. So we need to be very, very careful with this conversation because I think it could get very harmful very quickly.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that like a lot of times like language matters, and I
Mhm.
think that so I get a lot of pushback from my account or the information that I put out that I am anxiety producing, I am,
Yeah,
polarizing, like I'm causing anxiety in new parents and how dare you? And like that information is power, right? So like this
right,
high nurture, the information that I'm sharing, which right like it doesn't occur in the majority of babies, right? And
right.
like sort of like informed consent for like a tonsillectomy is like the
Yeah,
example that I
totally.
use. Like when you
Yeah,
go and you are going to have like a medical procedure or a surgery or something like that, like they give you the informed consent, and I think it's like 3%, it's 3, 5, or 7%. It's a very low percentage of individuals who die during a
right.
tonsillectomy,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
It's a
yeah.
super common surgery. It's very low, but they still talk about it. And like
Right.
you said, that could be anyone's kid. It could,
Yeah,
the percentage is low, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't happen.
right.
And I think that part of regulation to me should be that we talk about the physical risks, and we can do like a
Yeah,
whole we could do a
yeah.
whole workshop or whatever on that, but there are true physical risks to sleep
Yep.
training. And I think people get really, I don't know, they feel a certain way about the attachment, mental
Hmm.
health, emotional
Right,
piece of sleep training.
right,
Like it's not something that they can like tangibly,
right. Yes.
like
Hmm.
it's sort of subjective. And so I did a
Yep.
little experiment probably, I don't know, 4 months ago. And Greer actually called me out on one of my posts because I was like, okay, I'm not going to talk about it. I'm not going to talk about attachment. I'm not going to talk about mental
Yeah.
health. I'm not going to talk about any of it.
Right.
I'm only going to, for like 6 weeks, I'm only going to talk about physical, like more like objective
Hmm.
things that
Yeah,
could
yeah, yeah.
happen as a result of this. And the negative comments that I received like went to zero. It was very interesting. So there's
Wow. Yeah.
definitely like a link to that. And it was, I can't even remember what post it was, but it was, I did like, what do you call it? Like a sub tweet. Somebody
Yeah, yeah,
said
yeah.
like, I don't know why people don't want to sleep train. And so mine was like, this people don't want to sleep train because they're well informed. And I talked about like
Mm-hmm.
all the physical risks, and Greer was like,
Yeah.
well, I would argue like baby's mental health and attachment. And I wanted to be like, I'm doing an experiment, Greer.
Yeah, yeah,
Like, you're messing with my science.
yeah. That's
But it
funny.
was
Yeah.
very
Yeah, yeah, that's
interesting to see that people really like it. Maybe it's just like too subjective or
I've done something similar. Like you did the kind of physical risk side of it, and I did something similar with like the psychological impact of it because you're right. This sort of like attachment science or, the more abstract conversations are, I think you're right, subjective and hard for people to kind of grasp or understand like how it's related to sleep training. But I kind of did a similar post of like, forget the attachment conversation for a second. Like, what is the impact of inconsistent caregiving or sort of like unpredictable caregiving? Because that's what sleep training is there's unpredictability to it, and we have research for that. We have
yeah,
psychology experiments from that already from years ago. Like decades old research of the impact of like inconsistent or unreliable, unpredictable caregiving, and what that, puts on attachment styles. So again, it still is related to attachment, but it's not necessarily sleep training and attachment. It's like inconsistent caregiving and attachment, and kind of drawing those parallels, because that's what sleep training is. And we have that research. So for the people who are like, where's the research? Where's the research? Where's the data? We have it. We might not necessarily have it directly related to sleep training, because we can't do ethical sleep training research, which is a whole other conversation. The reason we don't have super foolproof research on sleep training is because it would be unethical to do that. But we have research in adjacent fields and adjacent domains where we've seen the impacts of sort of this inconsistent or unpredictable caregiving, where a parent is available sometimes but not available other times, or their responsiveness is conditional, or they are responsive one moment and then suddenly withdraw that responsiveness. The still face experiment. These types of research that's been done for years points us in the direction of there's parallels to sleep training that I think people struggle to see unless you have this hard science. And I think that's, connected to what you were saying too about the physical stuff or the medical risks, in terms
Yeah.
of how people perceive it.
Yeah. And I think it's really hard too, because you have like some genuine experts who
Yeah.
have gone to a lot of schooling. And it is more frustrating for me when that happens, because like this like board certified pediatrician who's an IBCLC, like you have loads, or you should have loads of education related
Right.
to like the foundations of lactation. If you are an
Right.
IBCLC, you should understand supply and demand, the
Yep.
physiology, and you have to blatantly ignore so much research
Yep.
to then
Yep.
say a 2 month old doesn't need to eat at night.
Yeah.
And so there's like this resistance to applying research that exists to something that is similar. And
Right.
like we have somehow turned into this like, show me the research, show me the, you don't need like
Yeah.
think think
Right.
for a second about how you would feel, or like
Yes.
if your spouse did this, or and it just like
Right.
goes into so many different aspects of parenting,
Yep.
not even tied to sleep, but like it is so common to see people who have these credentials. So in order to get the credential, I'm assuming that you're doing the education and you're leaning
Yep.
into the science and the research, and then you blatantly ignore it
Right.
to like fit your narrative or
Yeah.
something like
Fit your
that. And I
personal
think,
bias of like
yeah,
what you did with, your own family, or what you grew up with, what your maybe parents did with you, and you're like, dealing with some internal feelings about that. Like there's so much that goes into it that explains why people, promote the advice and the information they.
so I think like what you said, like when you were talking about it's like sort of the experiment that you did, and like something that is like really, so like if I have someone who has sleep trained their baby, not a
Yeah.
client, but like someone on social media who claims to be an expert, they have sleep
Yeah.
trained their baby from a very young age, and they are 10 toes down and this is not harmful. First of all,
Yeah.
you have sleep trained one, two
Right.
babies, like, and if you are a physician, or if you are a therapist or an occupational therapist or whoever you are, and you see children, you know better than
Yeah.
to say that any two children are the same, and that any
Yep.
one scenario impacts those children the same. So if you have sleep trained your child and you are going 10 toes down into it, one of the things that sort of raises a red flag for me is that to change your mindset to maybe a 2 year old. So like it's, if you sleep train, it is going to impact the way that you are attuned to your child for the rest of their
Yes.
lives, unless you do the work, right? You
Right.
have to, like, if you're like, okay, I'm going to be this attuned, high nurture parent who treats my child with autonomy,
Yeah.
and I'm not saying that people who sleep train don't do that, but what I am saying is that if you, like, you're setting yourself up for misattunement, and to like
Right.
recognize like your 2 year old now needs you to co-regulate. You're
Right.
denying co-regulation in infancy, and now your 4 year old needs you to co-regulate, and you
Yeah.
understand that, you sort of have to work through that, right? If you are continuing to, and I'm speaking specifically to professionals who are promoting sleep train, say I sleep trained my kids, that advice sort of has to be taken with a grain of salt, because in order
Yeah.
for that person or that expert to ever flip or consider the opposite, they have to do like some true work to say, like, I intentionally misattuned. Because if you sleep trained, then you did,
Right.
right?
There's a
Like,
huge
you did.
cognitive dissonance piece. That's what you're talking about here is cognitive
Yeah.
dissonance, and that's a huge part of this conversation. And actually, Greer had Dr. Tracy Castles on one of her podcast episodes like a while back, and Dr. Tracy Castles did a phenomenal job of explaining this cognitive dissonance that I don't even want to try to repeat because I can't do it justice, but we can maybe link that episode in the show notes here. But
Yeah.
there's a huge cognitive dissonance piece with families who have sleep trained. And to be honest, I really, really have compassion for those parents and for that piece of it. And I want to say that, with my full heart. Like, that's not me being sarcastic or patronizing or anything like that. Like, to have made a decision that you then maybe in hindsight were like, I wish I didn't make that decision, or I wish I'd approached that differently. And, there might have been some misattunement to my child. Like, that is a huge, like, I'm getting sort of chills just like imagining being in that position, because I can imagine how much that hurts and how much that like feels very upsetting and distressing to have to then be like, I might have done something that, caused a rupture in my relationship with my child. And no parent necessarily wants to do that, or wants to do that knowingly, or wants to see, that play out in a negative way. There's a cognitive dissonance piece there in terms of being able to recognize that rupture and recognize maybe where you had a misstep in those early days of parenting, with sleep training in particular, but with anything really, and having sort of the internal, like you said, internal conversations with yourself, internal work being done to repair and to choose a different path going forward. And for especially parents that are maybe public figures or even professionals, experts, these kind of people that a lot of parents listen to them, that's even harder to do. Like, the everyday parent who's not on social media or not a doctor, not a professional, maybe has a easier time dealing with that cognitive dissonance internally and working through it and then repairing with their child. But for a parent who is really sort of, like you said, 10 toes down, stood their ground on making this decision, that's going to be a lot harder to do. And it's easier psychologically to double down on the decisions you made than sort of work through it or see the other side of it. And again, I have a lot of compassion for that experience that those parents must be feeling. And I don't think that's a reason to stop having these conversations or to stop talking about the hard stuff related to this topic.
Perhaps there should just be like this disclaimer that, like, this is not like, it's not judgment, right? Like, it's information. And like, so everything that you just said, like, is sort of an experience I went through, not with sleep, but when I first moved in with my husband. And it was like
Yeah.
sort of my first experience with a child with high support needs and a child with what we thought were low support needs and
Yeah.
autism. And part of one of our child's journey was like, we did all the wrong things first. We put all of our eggs in one basket with this professional who was severely misinformed and was kind of was giving us advice that was really sort of detrimental to one of our
Yeah.
children. And sort of how I came into moving in with them was, like I said, I think I said it in the first episode, really this behaviorist lens. It's how I was
Yeah.
raised, and honestly quite ableist. Like, I just
Yeah.
didn't know. And
Yeah.
you have to work through that, right? Said things, I did things, I implemented things that
Yeah.
clearly were harmful.
Yeah.
And when things were harmful, there was obviously a behavioral manifestation that came from that.
Yeah.
And I responded through a behaviorist lens way. It was bad. It was really bad. And you have to, like, you do the best that you can do with the information that you have.
Yeah.
But like, it becomes a problem when you just won't listen or learn,
Right.
or you're just really resistant to
Totally.
I don't know what I'm trying to say. Like you just have
Yeah, no,
to,
I agree.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
no, I agree. And I can even give a personal anecdote on a a smaller scale too, or like a different domain. The truth is, my son, I probably gave my son too much screen time. For a period of time. When he was, and he's 2.5 now, and we really don't use it as much, and he doesn't even really care for it that much. But there was a period of time when, I was dealing with a lot, postpartum, and he's probably like 1.5 years. And I say postpartum, in the grand scheme, he wasn't like a 2 month old watching TV, but he was probably like 18 months old, and quite honestly was getting more screen time than I think was appropriate for him. And I was starting to see maybe the impacts on his behavior, his regulation. I was using it as a tool to help regulate myself and give myself a little bit of a break. But I was seeing the impacts on him. And for a little period of time, I was sort of doubling down like to myself of like, no, like it's okay because I'm using it for a purpose, or I'm using it because he needs it, or because I need it, or because I need the break, whatever it may be. And I really had to take a step back and say, like, no, this is not working for him. And it's not really working for me either. Like, what I thought maybe was serving this purpose of like letting him watch some TV, while I clean up, or while I, do laundry or whatever it may be, really isn't helping him. And it's not serving the purpose that I initially thought it would be serving. And I had to kind of, dial it back. And we ended up sort of removing certain screen time things. Like he was watching something on like an iPad for a while. We removed the iPad. We had to kind of like go backwards, and I had to admit to myself like this was not aligned with, the type of parenting I wanted to do going forward. And like you said, I made the best decisions I could with the information I had at the time, and really with my capacity that I had at the time. And from that aspect, I still remain confident and sort of like without shame for that decision. And I had to acknowledge when it was no longer working, or no longer, holding up to what I thought it was going to do, and make different decisions, and kind of regroup with regard to his screen time. So I hear you, and I think we need to. It's hard to have that sort of self reflection, and looking back on the decisions we made. Again, doing the best we could with the information and the capacity we had at the time, but that doesn't always mean it was the best decision forever, and should be the way we approach certain situations
Yeah.
forever.
Yeah, exactly that. I think too, I think it's Greer that says this, but trust the data that you are collecting from your children. Even if we are seeing a psychiatrist or a psychologist who is supposed to be an expert and is in a regulated industry, right? And they're supposed to be
Yep.
really educated. And if you are implementing those things, and that was really the beginning. That was before we had our youngest. And that was the beginning
Yeah.
for me of the ick. Like you feel this kind of feels a little bit like torture. It feels a little bit like I'm not being kind to my child.
Right.
Like trust, like we should have ended that. And hindsight's 2020. We should have ended
Yeah.
that
Always.
years before we did.
Yeah.
And we didn't. We just thought they gave him a wrong diagnosis, and we thought like this, what we were seeing was this wrong diagnosis. And I wish I had had, I don't even know, just the validation. Trust what you're seeing in your kid, lean
Yeah.
into
Right.
that. And I
Exactly.
think, yeah, I think that going back to what this episode is about, sort of like my biggest fear is if we remove the more nurturing side of sort of this industry, because it's the beginning, right?
Yes.
Especially for parents of autistic children. Obviously, this applies to everybody, but if you are the parent of a disabled child and you are being told in infancy, sometimes at 2 months, sometimes at 4 months, sometimes at 6 months, to miss a
Yeah.
tune,
Yeah.
you're in for a long,
Yeah.
you're going to go to therapy, early intervention, you're going to go to
Yeah.
specialists. You're going to be told, oh, it's okay. We'll just pin him down.
Yeah.
We'll put them in restraint. We went through some really crazy stuff that I absolutely should have been like, what? It just like sets the tone, and it like breaks my
Yes.
heart that like it starts the moment they come out, right?
Yeah.
Like don't put
Yeah.
them in bed with you. It starts
Right. Right. Right.
immediately, and you're in for a really long road. And the inability to sort of advocate, if you are, I don't want to say allowing, but if society is robbing you of the ability to like trust what you're seeing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's could be
Yeah.
really detrimental.
No, definitely. And I think the longer or the more, I don't know how to phrase this, the longer you're misattuned, the harder it is to kind of like get back to that attunement. And I don't say that as like, again, not a judgment or a shame or anything like that to other moms or other parents, but the more that, and you even might notice it, just in day-to-day stuff, like if your kid is at school for the whole day and you kind of like don't know how their day went or like what was going on for them, it takes some time of them coming home to like reconnect with each other. And that's normal and healthy, and that's what
Yeah.
happens. Kids grow up, they go to school, like maybe they go to daycare even or whatever, they spend the day with their grandparents, whatever it is. But it takes some time to kind of like get reattuned again with each other and kind of be connected again, because you were not privy to certain emotional states or certain things that went on in their day. And that's just, again, that's a healthy version of that reconnection. But when we're deliberately doing it with things like sleep training, and purposely misattuning, purposely disconnecting, we are doing it in a way that's negative and not helpful, like that misattunement that takes some time to get back to or to sort of like reconnect from after the fact, is just not helpful and not necessary. I don't know. I always say that our babies are going to have enough stressful events in their lives just because of the way the world works. We don't have to purposely give them stressful events or like purposely add stress and misattunement and like unresponsiveness, non-responsiveness to their lives. They're going to experience enough of that in the world because the world is not perfect and the world is going to throw them things that are going to be hard for them. We don't have to add to that on purpose. Yeah.
That speaks well to, I think we have a couple of episodes planned that you and I have kind of talked about, this idea of good enough parenting and how that language has
Yes.
sort of, we'll talk about it. It's not all positive, but like what you were saying, we don't need to make the decision like we don't need to electively add something that our children
Right.
need to be repaired. We don't need to
Right. Right.
electively do
Right.
something that
There's
we
going to
then
be
have to
enough of that.
repair from.
Exactly.
And then the other side of that, another episode that we had kind of discussed is what this sort of culture of like research and needing the data and like this
Yes.
inability to take one, like you spoke to this earlier really well. We have a lot of research and like I've made some pretty bold posts that people didn't like about it. We have research on
Yeah.
abuse strategies, right? In
Yeah.
women, in children, in individuals that grow up in an abusive home or perhaps with alcoholism or drugs or unchecked mental illness and things that we have the research. We know
Yes.
what it's like for a child who gets off the school bus and doesn't want to come inside because they don't know which
Right.
mom they're getting, right? That
Right.
inconsistent
Right.
caregiving.
Yes.
We have the research and it's okay to apply that to other
Yes.
areas, right?
Yes.
And that resistance to apply research, and this can be another episode, but it just doesn't. I'm so happy that we're doing this, and like it's not
Yes.
about sleep. This doesn't need to be a sleep
Yeah.
podcast, but if we're
Yes.
talking
Totally.
about like a child who struggles with apraxia of speech, there's so much other research related to the
Yeah.
nervous system and regulation and that professionals are like sort of unwilling to apply because
Yeah.
the research hasn't specifically been done about this specific thing
Yeah.
and like
Right.
they want to study, right? And it's kind
Right.
of
Right.
really
Right.
negatively impact things. So I think digging into
Yes.
that will be beneficial.
Yes, I agree completely. Yes, I think there's so many pieces to this puzzle, and it's funny because we started this conversation about like the BBC
I know.
regulation article, and like haven't even really necessarily talked
I
about the
know.
article specifically. And I think it goes to show that like there's so many layers and pieces to this puzzle. And the other thing that I just wanted to mention real quick is one of the other criticisms that I see coming out with this regulation conversation is that the BBC article specifically looked at sleep coaches in the UK. And I've gotten some pushback about like, this wasn't even about the US. And that really makes me curious why, that's part of the mindset because babies are the same everywhere. Like babies have the same needs everywhere. Babies need closeness, co-regulation, connection. Like babies have the same biological needs anywhere across the globe. And we, as sleep coaches, as people that support families are supporting families across the globe and supporting families of all different backgrounds, ethnicities, races, demographics in terms of the makeup of the family, like all those things. And so to say that like this conversation is only going to stay in the UK is just kind of naive in my opinion, because it really is not something that is going to exist in a vacuum. And that's why I think it's important that we're having, these conversations even here in the US, especially given the way the US tends to lean in terms of sleep and behaviorism and everything like that.
Yeah, I 1,000% I agree. I also think too that one of the things to consider is, where do we end regulation? What does it
Yeah,
cover? Are we just talking about sleep? Because how do you just talk about sleep? How do
exactly.
you, does this now extend to IBCLCs, or because
Yep.
they're talking about sleep too? They're talking about sleep feeds in the night. And does this extend to individuals who are sharing information on safe sleep? There are
Yeah.
accounts who, there are experts out there who are only
Yep.
discussing safe bed sharing, or
Yep.
what happens to those accounts if
Yeah.
there is this sweeping
Yeah.
sort of regulation. And what are we doing about, I mean, this could just go on and on. It just snowballs, right? There's
Snowballs. Yep.
this, yeah, there's this international code for, are you aware of the international code for like formula? There's no formula commercials.
Yes.
You don't, yeah,
Yes.
you don't see formula commercials on TV. It's an international code where we're protecting
Yep.
breastfeeding. And
Yep.
um, that has sort of gone out the window with influencers,
Yeah.
because now you can get
Yeah.
on social
Yeah.
media. And so that is tied to sleep too, in a
Yeah.
roundabout way. And like that impacts like bed sharing, because like
Right.
obviously you should be,
Yep.
especially before 4 months, a breastfeeding dyad, and all of those things kind of play a role. And then I could
Yeah.
go on forever, but and then what is reportable? Is someone
Right.
who is misrepresenting data? Is someone who is
Right.
saying this observational study that was intended to only observe what mothers do
Hmm.
when they're bed sharing, right? It's an observational study. We're not analyzing or
Yeah.
assessing risk, but they're making sweeping statements that different positions are safe,
Yeah.
and the language matters.
Totally.
So I
Totally.
think, yeah, like where does
Yeah.
that
And I
end
even
or go?
right, and even as like a therapist, like a mental health therapist, like you were talking about other industries. Yeah, like, even as a mental health therapist, like I, am a licensed therapist again in a regulated industry with a certification that helps me be more equipped to work with moms. And I even doubt sometimes, like I'll talk to a mom about sleep or bed sharing or something like that, and I have this moment of doubt where I'm like, am I even allowed to share bed sharing information, or am I even allowed to talk to this mom about sleep? If a mom is reporting to me as her therapist that she's falling asleep in her rocking chair with her baby, it feels like my due diligence to educate her on the risks of that and how to not do that and how to bed share safely. But is that like out of scope, or is that out of my regulation? So there's just so much to this, and so much of like, we ultimately have to come back to this sort of core value of supporting moms and babies. But even coming back to that core value seems to be like a hard task for some industries or some sort of professionals, of even coming back to that. Like, what are we doing here? What is the point of all of this? Is to support moms and babies, and we can't even seem to like agree on that sometimes, which is really problematic and concerning to me.
Yeah, and I think, I don't want to get too
Yeah.
political here,
Right.
but we have seen sort of some devastating things happen to women and babies based on states
Yeah.
implementing, this is what
Right.
a provider is allowed to say, this is when a provider
Right.
is allowed to intervene. And
Right.
that's really scary. When you say, when you're working with a client, there's sort of this fear, am I allowed to do this? And I wish the fear wasn't so on the nurture side. It just seems wild to me that it's on the nurture side. If I were a
Be-
postpartum nurse, I would have a really hard time not being afraid to tell a new mom, don't bring your baby to bed. Like
yes.
am I putting her in a position to sleep, I did, in a rocking
Right.
chair with her baby? I just put that nurse single-handedly, and sorry, but she did, in my ear telling me, do not ever bring your baby to
Yes.
bed. Babies die this way.
Yes.
I feel that should be reportable because that nurse single-handedly put me in a rocking chair with my baby where he was,
Yes.
I think it's 67 times
Yeah.
more likely to have a negative outcome than if I would have just safely brought him to bed,
Yep.
right? And we had all of the things. We had a firm mattress, we were breastfeed,
Yeah.
like the difference it would have made, and that professional from a regulated field, but
Yeah.
that's what her regulatory body
Right.
is telling her to say.
No, you bring up a good point about like the fear is on the nurture side because I was just thinking there's therapists out there who are like with no doubt in their mind telling moms to sleep train like their clients. And
Yeah.
like I'm over here like, afraid to tell clients like about safe bed sharing or like nurture and things like that, but there are therapists, in my regulated profession that have no problem telling their mom clients to sleep train. So that like that is really problematic to me too. I totally can relate to that. Yeah.
And it feels like these board certified
Yeah.
pediatricians, they know what informed consent is. They
Yeah.
know. They intimately understand that
Yes.
parents, patients, whatever should be able to make their own decision and should receive all of the information. So to me, it also feels, and I've said it over, like all these things feel reportable. If you recommend that a baby is sleep trained, right? They come to your office, they're 4 months old. You're, oh, you can sleep train now. Here's several different methods. And you don't tell that parent about aspiration risks. You don't tell that
Yeah.
parent about like sometimes kids have undiagnosed seizure disorders or metabolic
Right.
things going on. And these are the things to look for. And like the
Right.
reality is like you can't really look for aspiration, right? If your
Yeah.
baby's crying and they vomit, when they breathe in, that's when that happens.
Yep.
So we're not even doing an assessment, right? A provider should say, has your baby ever in the car or during a period of upset, if they have a colicky baby, has your baby ever become so dysregulated that they have vomited? And to me, if the answer is yes, immediate contraindication
Yeah.
to sleep
Yeah.
training. It doesn't matter if you're doing, the chair method or
Yeah.
Ferber or
Right.
whatever. It takes 1 second, and
Yep.
that's part of informed consent.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think there's so much that goes into this.
Well, I think that we could obviously talk about this for hours and hours, and we've covered so much today. That is a good spot for us to kind of end the conversation today. I know that we could go on about this forever, but if this is something that resonated with you, please share, like, subscribe, and we will be back soon for another episode of I Don't Know Who Needs to Hear This.
Sounds great. See you next time.
See you next time.